Globally, there were over 79.2 million confirmed COVID-19 cases, including over 1.7 million deaths reported to World Health Organization on December 27, 2020. In the Philippines, there were over 469,000 confirmed cases, including over 9,000 deaths reported to the Department of Health on the same date. While death and dying are natural and inevitable, discourse on this matter is entirely different when we talk about them in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, considering all the health protocols that bring potential alterations to funeral traditions. Particularly among Filipino Catholics, funeral vigils, funeral liturgies, and burials are social events that are participated by people who wish to pay last respects to the deceased and condole with the bereaved family. In most cases, several days are spent reciting prayers for the eternal repose of the dead persons in the presence of their bodies before they are buried. Along with the health sufficiency agendum of DOST's National Integrated Basic Research Agenda, specifically the social dimensions of health, my team implemented a research project entitled Funeral Tradition Alterations Due to COVID-19 Pandemic Health Protocols among Urban Filipino Catholics in Central Visayas. This study primarily aims to explore the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic health protocols imposed by the government on the funeral traditions of Filipino Catholics. Specifically, it looks into the following. First, funeral traditions of Catholics during normal times. Second, funeral protocols imposed by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic. Third, funeral traditions missed out by the bereaved families and relatives. Fourth and last, feelings of the bereaved families and relatives about how their loved ones' dead bodies were managed. The researchers employed interpretive phenomenology to capture the lived experiences of bereaved individuals and those who are knowledgeable about the funeral traditions of Catholics and the funeral protocols imposed by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic. This study covered the major cities in Central Visayas, namely Cebu City in Cebu Province, Tagbilaran City in Bohol Province, and Dumaguete City in Negros Oriental Province. Understandably, more deaths were recorded in cities than in municipalities because cities are commercial and industry hubs where a large number of people converge in relatively limited spaces, which makes viral transmission and infection reasonably high when health protocols are not strictly enforced and seriously complied with. The study participants consisted of two types in every city. The first type of participants is composed of 14 persons who are familiar with the funeral traditions of Catholics and funeral protocols imposed by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second type of participants is composed of 16 immediate family members and relatives of persons who died and were buried or cremated in the year 2020, regardless of whether the cause of death is related to COVID-19 or not. A total of 30 key informants per study site and an overall total of 90 key informants for the entire study agreed to undergo in-depth interviews. The interviews were digitally recorded, transcribed, translated, coded, and analyzed. Regarding the process of translation, all transcripts were double-checked by a bilingual translator who is competent in both Cebuano and English. Thematic analysis was employed in this study, and in vivo was used as an aid in analyzing the interview transcripts. The funeral traditions of Roman Catholics are captured in three major themes, namely entitlement to the ministries of the Church, social cohesion in times of someone's death, and final disposition of the dead body. All these traditions collectively embody the religious and communal aspects of paying last respects to someone who just died through the Church's liturgical services. The first major theme that emerged regarding funeral traditions of Catholics was entitlement to the ministries of the Church. The sub-themes are 9-day funeral vigil, funeral liturgy, songs and music, and the rite of committal. These sub-themes demonstrate how relate the funeral rites are that express reverence and love for the dead as manifested in the ministries of the church. The funeral vigil is an elaborate remembrance of the deceased before final disposition. This is the time before burial or cremation when families, friends, and parishioners come together in remembrance of the deceased to pray and support one another. During a funeral vigil, families of the deceased normally hire or invite prayer leaders to lead the Holy Rosary and lay ministers to lead the Bible service. It usually lasts for 9 days, but is sometimes extended to a few more days or even weeks to wait for the homecoming of those family members and relatives from other places. Presided by a priest, the funeral liturgy is celebrated in the presence of the dead body before its burial or cremation. During the funeral liturgy, prayer for God's mercy is offered for the deceased and solace for the living, including the entire faith community. This liturgy is concluded with a rite of commendation wherein prayers are recited and the coffin is sprinkled with holy water and is also incensed. A funeral procession to the final resting place follows thereafter. The Roman Catholic Church's musical tradition is a priceless treasure surpassing that of any other art form. The fundamental reason for this prominence is that it is a required or integral part of the solemn liturgy. Thus, lifting the prayer into song takes it to a new level of communication. As St. Augustine would put it, whoever sings well prays twice. The entire ministry of the Roman Catholic Church for her faithful departed is concluded through the rite of committal at the place of burial or interment, which is usually presided by lay ministers. This rite makes use of scripture readings, a few words of hope by the presider, intercessions, and prayers. Also, this rite marks the final act of the community of faith in caring for the body of its deceased member. The second major theme that emerged regarding funeral traditions of Catholics was social cohesion in times of someone's death. The social cohesion in times of someone's death is manifested in the following sub-themes: homecoming of significant others from other places, communal participation in the ministries of the church, and the offering of eulogy. In no instance during the pre-COVID-19 pandemic period that expressing reverence and love to a departed loved one and sympathy to the bereaved families happens in a solitary fashion. From the time a person dies and the moment his or her death is publicly announced, it is customary that family members, relatives, and friends from other places and countries would make an effort to physically visit the funeral home or residence where the body is lying in repose to pay last respects. Evidently, a person's death, therefore, is an opportune time for family and friends to reunite and keep social ties in times of grieving and mourning. The ministries of the church at the time of someone's death, namely the funeral vigil, funeral liturgy, songs and music, and the rite of committal, are affairs that are not only religious in nature but communal as well. Everyone is welcome to pay last respects to the deceased during a funeral vigil. Family members of the deceased are likewise involved in some of the liturgical roles as readers, persons to bring gifts and bread and wine to the altar during a funeral liturgy, and lay ministers and the community are involved as witnesses when the rite of committal is offered. Not to mention the support system from prayer leaders, locally known as manalabtan, during vigils, whose role is essential in leading the people in prayer. Social cohesion in times of someone's death is further magnified in the delivery of eulogy by family members and friends during a funeral vigil, which signifies the community's remembrance of the deceased. The comforting and consoling effects, therefore, of eulogy to the listening public, especially the bereaved family, cannot be disregarded. The third major theme that emerged regarding funeral traditions of Catholics was final disposition of dead bodies. The final disposition is done either through traditional burial or cremation. The Catholic Church's reverence for the sacredness of the human body as the temple of the Holy Spirit is continued up to the body's death. This explains why the Church's normal manner of reposing the body of a deceased member follows the traditional burial or entombment at a consecrated place like a Catholic cemetery, which is consistent with the belief in the resurrection of the body at the Last Judgment. Burial usually takes place during the daytime and on weekends to allow more participation of people who work during weekdays. On the other hand, the Church does not completely oppose cremation. It permits cremation provided that it does not demonstrate a denial of faith in the resurrection of the body. Cremated remains are not supposed to be scattered on the sea, in the air, or on the land, nor kept at the home of a relative or friend of the deceased, as these practices are not the reverent disposition that the Church requires. Therefore, cremated remains are ideally entombed in a mausoleum or columbarium or buried in a grave. The imposition of enhanced community quarantine in the country prohibited mass gatherings such as religious gatherings, including the funeral vigil, funeral liturgy, and burial. The lived experiences of study participants in terms of the funeral protocols during the COVID-19 pandemic were captured in three major themes, namely regulation of the Church's ministries, limited participation in funeral traditions, and immediate disposition of dead bodies. The first major theme that emerged regarding the funeral protocols imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic was the regulation of the Church's ministries. The sub-themes include cancellation of funeral vigil and funeral liturgy, omission of songs and musical texts in liturgies, and unceremonious burial. DOH Memorandum Number 2020-0067 orders that remains of COVID-19 related deaths shall not be taken to any place of public assembly, and viewing of the deceased shall not be permitted. It was further reinforced by DOH Memorandum Number 2020-0158, which stipulates that wakes or any form of public assemblies shall not be allowed, not only for confirmed COVID-19 cases, but for the suspect and probable cases as well. Obviously, this protocol altered the observance of time-honored funeral traditions of Roman Catholics. There is no more funeral vigil for the remains of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases. Consequently, families, friends, and parishioners can no longer physically come together in remembrance of the deceased to pray and support one another. Prayer leaders were no longer hired. Eulogies were no longer delivered. While funeral vigil for the non-COVID-19 related deaths was permitted, however, there was a limit on the number of days to hold such, 3 to 5 days only. Still, due to the prohibition of taking the remains of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases to any place of public assembly and viewing the deceased, the Catholic Church was compelled not to celebrate a funeral liturgy, including the rite of commendation in the presence of the physical body. As what one participant shared, I called my older sister in Manila and said, "Sister, father is gone and was buried directly because he is said to be a COVID-19 suspect." My father was buried at 11 o'clock in the evening. That is why we were not there to accompany him during his death and properly make arrangements for him. No funeral vigil nor funeral mass was accorded to him. As what another participant expressed, when he died, we were not able to do anything because it was already the government who made the decisions. If it were on us, we would have performed funeral services or mass observing even to the extreme of the health protocols. But the dead becomes untouchable, so the Church cannot do anything of their situation. To shorten the time when people are gathered together and exposed to each other, During the celebration of the funeral liturgy for non-COVID-19 related deaths, musical texts and songs during the said liturgy were omitted and participation of choirs was discouraged. What used to be an approximately 1.5 hours funeral liturgy was abbreviated to 20 to 30 minutes. As some participants shared, the funeral mass was shortened. There was no more singing. It was like they have summarized and sped up everything during the funeral liturgy at the church. Instead of having the usual singing, everything went by fast at the church. Songs were already canceled. The rite of committal was altered for the remains of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases. No rite or ceremony whatsoever was accorded to the remains of COVID-19 related deaths. They were unfortunately buried unceremoniously. Meanwhile, remains of non-COVID-19 related deaths were afforded with a rite of committal similar to how it was done during the pre-pandemic period. As some participants expressed, there are no priests or lay ministers present at the gravesite to offer final prayers before the COVID-19 related dead bodies are buried. We bury bodies right away. My son was buried right away. There was neither a lay minister nor a priest to say final prayers. It is really different these days now. The second major theme that emerged regarding the funeral protocols imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic was limited participation in funeral traditions. The sub-themes are physical distancing, restrictions imposed upon returning OFWs, and unattended or less attended burial. The celebration of the funeral liturgy at the church was permitted for non-COVID-19 related deaths. However, restrictions were strictly imposed on the number of attendees to allow physical distancing. To avoid celebrating the funeral liturgy in an enclosed space, one church in the region did not allow entry for the deceased and mourners. The liturgy was celebrated at the church's main entrance with only 10 seats prepared for immediate family members. One participant shared, "The LGU gives 3 days for the wake of non-COVID related death. Only the immediate family members are allowed to be in the house or in the funeral parlor. Mass gathering is not allowed." Another participant expressed, "There is still the prayer for the dead one at home, but there should be physical distancing." Returning OFWs who were undergoing mandatory quarantine may attend or witness the funeral vigil and burial of their loved ones who died not due to COVID-19 but must wear personal protective equipment or PPE, be accompanied and guarded by a city health office personnel, must not come closer to anyone around, including family members, relatives, and friends, and in certain occasions must stay only inside the government vehicle which brought them to the cemetery during burial. They were also brought back to the quarantine facility after the funeral vigil visitation and burial to complete their 14-day quarantine. As what one participant shared, there was one returning OFW who was still in quarantine in an isolation facility but was allowed by the city health office to visit during the funeral vigil for his father who died of non-COVID related cause. She was accompanied by CDRRMO staff. She was able to visit the wake but on a limited time and was not allowed to get closer and interact with others, even her family. She was also brought back to the isolation facility after an hour. Moreover, the limited participation in funeral traditions was also observed in the unattended or less attended burial. DOH Memorandum Number 2020-0067, DOH Memorandum Number 2020-0158, and DILG Memorandum Circular Number 2020-063 consistently mandated that adult members of the family are permitted to attend the burial of the remains of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases. In most cases, however, the burial of the remains of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases was not attended by members of the family since they too must strictly stay home following exposure to the deceased who was considered as a carrier or potential carrier of COVID-19, especially when the person died in his or her residence. In addition, burial attendees cannot get closer to the gravesite or coffin. They only observe the burial from a distance. One participant expressed, only one or two adult members of the bereaved family are allowed to witness the burial of a departed loved one. They are not even allowed to get closer to the gravesite. They only observe the burial at a distance. Another participant shared, at that time we were quarantined here, and then he was buried without us. Only one of my kids was there. At that time, we really cannot understand what we were feeling. It was a different kind of pain that could not be explained. The third major theme that emerged regarding the funeral protocols imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic was immediate disposition of dead bodies. The government, through DOH Memorandum Number 2020-0158 and DILG Memorandum Circular Number 2020-063, boldly mandate the burial or cremation of suspect, probable, and confirmed COVID-19 cases within 12 hours after death. As a result, burying of dead bodies at any time of the day, including midnight and dawn, was commonplace during the pandemic period. As what some participants shared, for COVID-related deaths, you have to bury the bodies within 12 hours from the time of death. When dead bodies of COVID-19 related deaths arrive at the cemetery, whether the family members are present at the gravesite or not, the bodies have to be buried immediately. The burial has to proceed without any delays. We need to do so since we have to go back to the hospitals which might have bodies that died of COVID-related causes which have to be disposed of right away. When my son died, he was buried straight away. My wife and I were not able to attend it. The lived experiences of family members whose loved ones passed away during the pandemic, particularly in terms of the funeral traditions missed out, were described and understood through the two major themes, spatio-temporal freedom and the warmth of physical presence. The first major theme that emerged was spatio-temporal freedom. The sub-themes included unrestricted funeral space, temporal freedom, and immediate communal prayers. During the pre-pandemic period, there were no restrictions as to the number of people who can participate in vigils, funeral liturgy at the church, and the rite of committal and burial at the cemetery, hence the unrestricted funeral space. Until the COVID-19 pandemic was declared, the implementation of physical distancing led to a sense of restricted funeral space for families and friends of the deceased. As one of the participants mentioned, we have not really gotten inside the church during the funeral mass. We were just outside. It seemed really informal, but I guess that was their church's protocols. Children were not allowed to attend funeral gatherings, and this limited their expression of grief, and not being there for their deceased friend for the last time was painful to them. As one parent shared, some of his comrades in soccer were not able to attend. They were said to be crying hard because they really wanted to come, but they were not permitted by their parents because of COVID-19. They were really crying. The funeral vigils during the COVID-19 pandemic were allowed for non-COVID-19 related deaths, but with limited time, since mourners cannot stay all night long due to the imposition of curfew. Temporal freedom was therefore missed out in the observance of certain funeral traditions. Some participants in the study expressed at 10 or 11 o'clock in the evening, the police would already be roving and making reprimands. Go home already, only household members should be on vigil. The difference actually is having the hours shortened during the funeral liturgy. It was like they have summarized or hastened up everything. Instead of having the usual singing, everything went by fast at the church. For all the times I have attended burials, usually the mass would take too long to finish. When the pandemic hit, Immediate communal prayers are missed out, particularly for those who died of COVID-19 or COVID-19 related causes. As what one of the participants shared, we could not really hold a prayer because we were under quarantine. We only got to hold a prayer for the deceased after 9 days. On the 9th day, the prayer was sadly delayed. The second major theme that emerged was the warmth of physical presence. The sub-themes are presence of the dead in death and the presence of the living in death. The presence of the dead body during funeral vigils, in the presence of relatives, neighbors, and friends in the observance of funeral traditions are what the bereaved families missed out when their loved ones died during the pandemic. For the participants, not being able to have one final look at the dead body deprived them of their subjective connection to the deceased. As what one participant shared, we have lost a loved one, but we cannot even see him for the last time. Like one moment he is brought to the hospital, last thing you know, he is already buried. Because when they say the body should be buried, then it has to be buried. Moreover, not being able to commune with members of social groups deprived the participants of their social ties. As what some participants recounted, I led a prayer here when my husband died. Jesus, it was lonely. There were just 3 or 4 of us. It was really lonely. Relatives could have grieved with the family, but they can no longer do that. Only the neighbors can be with you. The cousins who are from afar can no longer come. Plus the 14-day quarantine, and the dead will already be buried. Because the dead should be immediately buried, we can no longer wait for the relatives from afar. The feelings of the bereaved families about the manner of managing dead bodies were described and understood through the 3 major themes: constricted human connectedness, deprived to physically convey love and respect for the deceased, and strengthened familial solidarity. The first major theme that emerged was constricted human connectedness. The sub-themes are social stigma, faceless funerals, and lonely death mourning. There was social stigma during the wake visitation due to fear of SARS-CoV-2 virus transmission. As one of the participants in the study shared, there was that feeling when people looked at me like I was some kind of virus, as in like there were so many people and it seemed like they were so far and distant from my path. Faceless funeral was also experienced by some participants because of the wearing of masks and face shields. Family members of the deceased found it hard to recognize people who truly came and gave comfort because all the funeral attendees were wearing face masks and face shields. As one of the participants shared, you could not even recognize people anymore because everybody is wearing face masks. Especially when they had face shields on, we all had blurry vision due to the perspiration. It was very difficult. Furthermore, there was lonely death mourning. Only the family members were allowed to attend the funeral liturgy and burial. Bereaved individuals from far places cannot come home and therefore have to mourn in solitude. There were just a few of us in the church. We were probably just less than 20 that time. We were informed ahead that only family is allowed. One immediate family member who was a returning OFW and was allowed to view the deceased before burial was only given a limited time to mourn her parents' death. Due to physical distancing measures as a COVID-19 health protocol, no one can go near the grieving family member to comfort her while she mourns the death of the deceased. One participant shared, "We also asked permission from the mayor to visit just for one night, but we did not come close since a guard was there. The people inside were asked to go out and she entered alone. She was so pitiful as she was crying because no one comforted her. So she was really pitiful." Missing the normal opportunities to express goodbye made the participants feel deprived of the opportunity to physically convey their love and respect towards the deceased and condolences to the bereaved family. As some participants shared, I feel a little guilty. I would have wanted to serve even at the last moments of my father. When my niece died due to COVID-19, she was placed in a body bag, then was transported to the cemetery. Only one of her children was allowed, though far, to be in the cemetery at that time. It was 5 o'clock in the morning and the rite of committal was not performed. The third major theme that emerged was strengthened familial solidarity. The sub-themes are face-to-face funeral engagement and virtual funeral engagement. The participants in this study felt that their familial solidarity was strengthened despite the health risk. Family members took the risk of getting infected just to personally express their condolences and sympathy to the immediate family of the deceased. Another participant expressed, "My dad's relatives, those who come from afar, although not necessarily across the sea, were all there. Our family only gets to see one another when someone dies." Others who could not physically come due to the restrictions engaged in virtual means through Zoom, Google Meet, FaceTime, or Facebook Messenger calls. One participant shared, "Since I am a Singles for Christ member here, we held a virtual vigil for Mama via Zoom and then prayed the rosary. Virtual vigil was an alternative to provide comfort and express grief." One participant shared, "It was better before because you could really socialize if there was a funeral wake. At present, it was more on virtual. Those siblings who live abroad would just call just to be able to witness the wake. That was our only means." On the whole, findings in our present study support and confirm the findings in the study of Hamid and Jahangir 2020 conducted in Kashmir, India, which revealed that the COVID-19 pandemic has undoubtedly changed and reshaped the traditional practices and rituals related to dying, death, and mourning. They noted that the usual grieving process is being changed, causing the bereaved to mourn in solitude without any help and comfort, thereby adding another layer of sorrow to the already existing loss. The same phenomenon was documented in Spain by Fernandez and Gonzalez 2020, who revealed the social and cultural impact of the pandemic on the dignity of the dead and the grief of the living. The authors suggest that some of the most crucial stressors in the COVID-19 pandemic are lockdown and lack of rituals. They concluded that when relatives are dying, the social distancing protocol is extremely difficult to bear. Furthermore, Cardoso et al. 2020 concluded that in Brazil, the mourning has become even more unbearable and incomplete the moment family members are prohibited from performing farewell rituals due to the constraints imposed by the government during a pandemic. Thus, findings in our study add to the growing literature that given the changes in traditional funeral practices to secure more lives from the risk of infection from COVID-19, there is therefore a need to provide access to bereavement support and palliative care to create meaningful and culturally appropriate funerals in order not to intensify the grief. This infographic summarizes the themes and sub-themes regarding the funeral traditions of Roman Catholics, funeral protocols imposed by the government during the COVID-19 pandemic, funeral traditions missed out by the bereaved families and relatives, and their feelings about how their loved ones' dead bodies were managed. Here are a few takeaways. While the funeral traditions are valued, observance of such is partially altered in consideration of the health protocols amid this global health crisis brought about by the COVID-19. The Catholics' adaptive capacity allows them to still observe the funeral traditions in a limited sense without totally neglecting the observance of health protocols through the aid of communication technologies and the internet. The researchers recommend, among others, for the inclusion of church representatives like bishops, priests, and lay ministers in the planning and implementation of protocols that have a direct and indirect relationship with the management of dead bodies during a pandemic to ensure dignified death. enactment as well of the provision of technology-aided funeral ministries in coordination with the Catholic Church. Lay ministers or priests should be present in cemeteries during burial to recite final prayers for the dead bodies prior to interment. Conduct stress debriefing for bereaved families who missed out on some funeral traditions when their loved ones died during the pandemic. Finally, future studies may explore the funeral traditions of other religious groups in the country and how these traditions are reshaped by the COVID-19 health protocols. Before I end, I would like to acknowledge my co-researchers, namely Dr. Helen Buholano and Dr. Remedios Bacus of Cebu Normal University, Dr. Bernabe Mijares of Bohol Island State University, and Dr. Frislin Limsaco and Dr. Enrique Oracion of Silliman University. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the National Research Council of the Philippines of the Department of Science and Technology through its NRCP Science and Technology Experts Pool or NSTEP for providing funding for this project. That concludes my presentation. Maraming salamat sa pakikinig at magandang agham sa ating lahat.